Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the channel. I hope that you are all doing well. I've got a great guest, along with a great book that I think all of you are going to be interested that is out now with Passage Press. I am joined by the one and only John King Spiezio. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Anytime, anytime. I'm always happy to shine a light and to give the spotlight over to the authors and writers of sort of the burgeoning and emerging literary scene in this thing of ours. So let's just get into it then. Why don't we let people know a little bit about you? You are a man who has a new book out, a great, wonderful introduction I saw today when Passage Press announced it. He just went in and brought down that PBR like it was nobody's business. It's a great way to make an entrance. So what can you tell the audience about yourself?
I come from a background in classical literature, so studied classics and Oriental studies over at Oxford. Big fan of Homer, Ovid, that sort of a thing. So that's always been my main literary background. Hadn't really done a lot of creative writing, I suppose, but had the idea for this book a few years ago, I guess just about 3 years ago, and wrote it out. Wasn't really sure what to do with it, but had the lovely opportunity to get to know some of the people from Passage Press. I met Lomez over in Wyoming at a place called the Wagon Box that we're both pretty involved with, and was just speaking with him there about state of contemporary literature. We had some similar feelings about it, and I told him I'd written a novel, and he told me to send it to him. So I gave him a PDF, and he gave me a contract. And now we're here. I guess that was last summer, but spent some time editing it, getting it ready, and now it's all printed and coming out to you.
Well, we're excited to get our hands on it, to read it. And I mentioned earlier before we went live on the air that, I've had the chance to read through about 2/3 of it, and I've been quite a fan of it so far because it grapples a lot with sort of the questions that get discussed today in sort of these scenes, but also just as someone who appreciates the questions of the classics, I'm a huge fan of Virgil. So to sort of see how we have to clash with our ancient pre-Christian traditions, as well as how things are in our sort of Christian societies, is always a fun thing to see get explored in fiction. Fiction
Yeah.
is always the great platform to explore these ideas.
So I'm a proper classicist. That's not really my background, but as you sort of allude to, the main character in the book is not a classicist. He's studying and teaching, I suppose, at this point, really ancient Germanic literature, so Old English, Old Norse, that sort of thing, and that brings to the fore a lot more of the question of his own relationship to ancient ethnic religion, classical Germanic paganism, and that sort of a thing. And that's one of the sort of central tensions in the book. Is he's sort of a lapsed New England Protestant trying to decide if he should get back in the good graces of the Christian God or if it's not really anything that he's been interested in the first place. And he sort of has these vaguely Nietzschean ideals about vitalism and that sort of a thing. And he sort of plays out those ideas in his life over the course of the book.
And is that something that, with your own interests in the classics has brought you to, bring this story to the forefront? Is this something that you've endured with yourself personally, or is this something that you've engaged with in your academic circles or your own literary reading that you thought maybe I should flesh these ideas out further?
Yeah, well, they were ideas that I had in my own head. So all the conversations and monologues and things like that in the book are conversations that existed in my mind. And like one of the characters says early on, it's sometimes better to explore these ideas visually and seeing them come to life in the form of characters rather than just laying it out in a monograph in a long philosophical text, because then there's not really a real world reference point for what these ideas actually look like when they come to life. So using different characters almost as living embodiments of ideologies and letting them bounce off of each other and that sort of a thing, I think is a big part of why I wanted to write the book, just sort of for myself as a little sandbox to run an experiment in.
No, and I quite enjoyed these discussions, whether it's with the sort of high Oxford society towards the beginning of the book. The question: Are you a Wagnerite? Are you interested in these sort of classical themes, and are you just liking art for art's sake because I like it in that Philistine way? Because the book, the first 2/3 of the book really do hit at these questions about the ancient traditions, the pre-Christian traditions in Europe, especially, and what that means for sort of these academic circles, but also just a society that is running into the midst of modernity. This is a story that takes place at towards the end of the 19th century, but I feel like we're doing ourselves a great disservice, despite the fact that it's in the title. We should tell people what this book is even called, and what is the lovely title of your book.
Something of the Springtime.
There you go. Something of the Springtime. And it's available, of course, down in the links below in the description. But I do highly recommend reading this text, because for those that get to see these debates play out, maybe on the Twitter sphere or on Substacks or in various academic journals or essays or the rest, I got to appreciate it in quite in depth, just because I see these dialogues happen all the time between sort of my Christian and more vitalist friends, both on the timeline and also in conferences and conversations I've had with people in meet space. So to see it kind of play out in a fictional setting is nice, because like you said, it's a great place to have these conversations that you have in your own head come to life.
Yeah, and sort of orthogonal to the Christian versus vitalist thing, of course. You mentioned that he's in a society that's starting to come to grips with modernity, but he's also in two different societies. So he's an American. That's sort of the conceit, but he's over in England. And so part of the sort of texture of the conversations is also trying to understand the relationship between Americans and the old world. He's looking for a home. He's trying to understand what a homeland is, whether he should be trying to reconnect with some sort of ancestral root over in England, or rather he should say that the ties are completely cut and go for broke and just accept America on its own terms as this sort of new society, a new sort of a nation.
Yeah, it was a conversation that I very much got to enjoy personally. I grew up as an army brat, so I've lived in both Germany and in England for quite a bit of time in my formative years. So that question about America as its own independent thing, or its relationship to the old world, is something I still rack with now as I enter my 30s. And it's a great conversation piece, because anyone who is, and you yourself had spent time over in Oxford. I grew up not so far outside of London. I've been all over in Germany and Western Europe. I have this deep appreciation for what's there, because anyone who's lived overseas or has taken the time to travel, you're witnessing manuscripts, people, languages, ideas, locations that have been around for millennia and centuries. And America doesn't really have that. It's the old saying of 100 years in America seems like a long time, but 100 miles is forever to the European.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, I mean, that brings us to sort of the book itself. I mean, we have an academic from America that is now over in England, and in the height of the old world, getting to experience these great changes. People who are saying God is dead. We have the French Revolution, the revolutions of the 1840s, and now it's late 1880s, and he's coming to midst of his puritanical Congregationalist roots, in the midst of a world that is beginning to experience perhaps a taste of what came before.
Yeah, and he's sort of taken aback and confused by the sense of decay, because America at that point is really coming into its first major industrial peak, and everything in America is very beautiful and gilded, and everybody's very excited about using technology to achieve greatness and push us on into the future. But as soon as he gets over to Europe, everybody is telling him that actually modernity is cancerous and all order has fallen apart and everything's about to collapse completely. And I guess they're right, because then the First World War happens a few decades after this. But I think when we are looking now in an election coming up where sort of the Elon Musk branch of tech optimistic, futuristic libertarian right-wing optimism is grafting itself onto a movement that many people saw as a sort of Pat Buchanan, paleoconservative, traditional American thing. It's interesting to see how those two can work together, I suppose.
Yeah, and I feel as if, and this is going to be out before the election, and I guess only time will tell when uh, what the results may yield or what comes next. But it has been really interesting to witness these clashes of what you would, I guess, paleoconservatism with this, effective acceleration, or even on the side of the left, perhaps the effective altruism and these sort of finance technological innovations that somehow we can innovate our way out of modernity's woes, will while sort of providing a new fusionism, almost as if
You
we
just
now
push
have.
right through.
Yeah, just push right through. We'll just take the cinder block right onto the accelerator, and we'll just make it through industry.
Yeah.
Uh, and it is interesting because you see these conversations play out in the book, where our main American character is speaking to these people, and it's just like, well, I suppose it takes time for things in America to have whatever comes to the old world come to America, just due to the great distance of the ocean. Whereas now we live in a time where that doesn't exist anymore. The internet has flattened all things. I've jokingly said that Kierkegaard's The Leveling has come, and it's just through the internet, and it's, instead of a Grey Goose scenario about maximizing paperclip production, it's just rainbow colored paperclips everywhere. And I
And brain
feel as
rot.
if yeah, right, just Kierkegaard and the gay paperclip. I think it was an essay I wrote a few years back. But I feel as if the text itself, your novel, gets to really explore those fun questions, sort of that sickness unto despair, which I felt like was very much referenced in some of the dialogue in the book. And then,
Yeah,
uh,
it's
go ahead.
there aren't a lot of explicit references. Well, I guess they're references. There aren't name drops of
No.
particular philosophers. Even they talk about the God is dead thing, but there's no talking about Nietzsche with the name Nietzsche, and there's no talking about Kierkegaard with the name Kierkegaard. But he's sort of under the surface, and the spiritual crisis, I suppose, that the main character James is going through is basically a sort of Kierkegaardian existential crisis.
Hmm. And I feel as if those two writers, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, are just kind of essential reading to one another. They live, of course, in different decades in the 19th century, but I feel as if they are both grappling with the very question of modernity and the spiritual crisis that is underneath it. I've told people on my channel and other shows that I think that it's essential reading that you read Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard together. One gives you the fictional lens to sort of explore these ideas, and then, of course, I think Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are both trying to grapple with the same crisis of modernity and meaning that I think is very clear to say have both been dragged out to the 21st century.
Yeah, it seems like Dostoevsky comes closest to a meaningful answer, I guess. Um, Kierkegaard winds up just sort of screaming into a hole, and I guess Nietzsche goes mad. Dostoevsky seems like he at least finds some sort of peace with his religious tradition that he chooses. So maybe that's the most important one. I don't know, but
Well, I would say it's the most fleshed out, at least in terms of what he lives, although the man certainly had his own vices, with respects to his own passions, whether it be gambling or otherwise, his own revolutionary idealism. But even then, those three, I think, are just sort of essential reading to sort of grapple with that question of meaning and modernity, especially now when so many people are looking at the ruins of their own civilization. I mean, America is certainly not the America that either of us grew up in or our parents grew up in, and it leaves people questioning, well, why would I want to be an Episcopalian when there's so many gay pride flags all over the churches in New England? Or perhaps I should want to look at something older and more ancient, and can that be synthesized? And that's been a great deal of debate and discussion, both in academic and political circles. And so it's nice to see it again, a novel sort of explore these things in the time frame when these questions are really being asked. And also that great American question about what is America, what is a home, and what is my relationship to the old world. That we are a common people separated by a common language, as the old joke goes about American and our friends across the pond.
yeah. And I guess you haven't finished it, but it doesn't really come to any satisfactory answers. I'm not sure, but maybe that's a strength. I don't think it's the sort of book you should come away from thinking that the answers have been laid out for you very clearly, but as a sort of series of mental exercises, like a Socratic dialogue, rather than something that comes to a definition of justice or whatever. It just gives you a nice little run through the ringer, and getting you to think through these things on your own to a certain extent.
And you had mentioned that, you've had this idea rumbling in your head for quite some time. I mean, what was your experience living over and studying in Oxford? I mean, when did these questions really begin to hit home for you?
Um, well, I suppose in my second year, um, I started reading a lot of Kierkegaard, uh, and had been coming from a Catholic childhood and then sort of standard teenage Reddit atheist phase, and then decided very suddenly that God existed and wasn't really sure what exactly that meant, uh, how to make sense of the divine and how to relate to it properly. Um, and I'm not sure I've fully come to a satisfactory answer yet at this time. But I guess I had explored a sufficient number of back alleys over the course of half a decade or so. By the time that I wrote this, that yeah, I felt prepared to lay some of them out, sort of on a map next to each other.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very similar sort of experience I had. I think one of the things that growing up I still appreciate to this day, for instance, is that visiting that grand Gothic cathedral in Cologne, and then right next to it, if you've ever been there, is that great Roman colony museum
Hmm.
where it has all the tombs and all
It's
of
right
the.
underneath it.
It's right underneath it. It's it's
It's
it's
pretty
it's a
cool.
beautiful representation of just how old the old world is and what has emerged out of Rome and the Christianity that would eventually be the religion of the empire. And those are questions I still deal with. I jokingly tell people, I said, I think all the time that my entire world of politics and everything I talk about is just trying to make sense of growing up as an army brat during the global war on terror
Yep.
overseas, and just trying to make sense of what on earth is my country and what on earth does it mean to have some semblance of identity, because we're so clearly different from the old world. I think that I'm sure you've seen that. I hate to reference a meme, but I'm sure you've seen it where it's the description of like European forests and it has all the little friendly folklore
Oh yeah,
characters.
and you've
And
got the
then you have
windows.
the American where it's the Wendigo just hunting down a bunch of hunters who are in plate gear and firearms. And I feel like there's a raw inner truth. It strikes a nerve that really is sort of the difference between ourselves, is that we are at our root a frontier people that hasn't had the pleasure of 1,000-year history.
And now we're getting all the luxury that should build up over 1,000 years over the course of about 50. It's sort of
Yes, for better
documented.
and for worse, it's all right there for us to deal with and imagine, and we get to have the exact same dialogues that John gets to have in your book about what does it mean to have a country, that romantic nationalism, or how much must we proclaim how much we love something, and does that come off as performative? Does it come off as sincere or fake? And I don't think that we've yet to come up with a sufficient answer. I like the dialogue that John has with his friend's wife about third of the way into the text, wherein they're walking right before it begins to rain, and he's
Mhm.
discussing about, well, if I were to say I love my wife so much that I can't help to bring it up in conversation, people would think I've killed my wife and I'm throwing it off the scent.
Yeah,
And you see that a lot, I think, with some of the performative aspects of Americanism. It almost borders on kind of a kitschy or gauche display where it's just like, do you really love it, or are you just grifting?
yeah, or not just grifting. It's a psychological. You're grifting your soul to a certain extent. It's not just trying to get Zuck bucks or whatever you get for engagement on Twitter, Elon bucks.
Yeah.
Um, but I think what they say in the conversation is that on a psychological level, people want to care about something. You want your life to be meaningful, and you want to suffer for a reason because you're suffering anyway. And so sometimes nationalism can fill in a certain hole there. But I do also think um, that doesn't. It's not supposed to be something that's anti-nationalistic in that way, because I still think there is a sort of healthy, naive, organic nationalism that a healthy society is going to have. But it's when these things become conscious and making up for a lack that it starts to feel a little bit inauthentic, and then doesn't really do the job of nurturing your soul that it's supposed to do in the first place.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and I don't think that the text itself, your novel, comes off as an anti-nationalist reader tirade. I just find that dialogue to be very prescient for the times that we live in, because so much of it is performative. That you want everyone to see how great you are, that your suffering has meaning, that you're willing to die for freedom or liberty or some other cause. And in some instance, I think that so much of what we have in America going on is kind of reflective of these very identity national based questions that emerged out of 1848. I think of Ernest Renan's What is a Nation very often when I see these debates play out, that we still live in that shadow of liberalism and the revolutions that came out of it, but at the same time those questions are very sincere and very important questions that do need to get answered. And America, of course, by experiencing everything that it has in the last 50 years, gets to have its own little 48 moment, I think, much sooner rather than later. Or you could argue that the 48 moment came in the 60s.
Or came in 1776.
Or it came in 1776, right? But at the same time, it's experienced all different sorts of revolutions. Because, you could say the French Revolution happens in 1789, but even then, what comes right afterwards is a series of revolutions, and 48 and 1868 and another, so there's all these cycles you could argue that happen through. And I think that because we live in the technological moment we're in, we get to experience these way faster. I'm sure that you've noticed that, if you're on Twitter for too long, your perception of time gets warped, or any kind of social media. You're like, wow, that was 5 years ago. It feels like 500. And
I don't think anyone's had a sense of time since the lockdowns, whatever.
Oh, I would agree wholeheartedly. It feels as if everyone's trying to reset themselves, that maybe the last 3 or 4 years it didn't happen, but they certainly did. Everyone's coming out of a fugue state, which again sort of is that history repeats itself moment. We're on this precipice of this great election that's about to take place. Great is, the audience could feel in what I mean by great. But I remember right after Obama got elected, there was that Robin Williams went on tour. He had this great sort of stand-up comedy tour that he did, and he had said, it's like, we're all coming out of this fugue state since Clinton, and we've all just emerged from a drug. And he's just like, well, where's Bill? And he's like, well, Bill's been, impeached, and Bush is now president, and now we've elected a black guy named with Hussein for his middle name. And it's the same thing with COVID, right? It's just like, well, where's Trump? And he's like, oh, he's running for office again. But it's like, we thought that happened. It's like, oh, Biden's in there, and now Biden's gone, and Kamala's there, and now the Europeans have something to complain about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, go on. It'll be interesting, to say the least. I was quite appreciative of the fact that sometimes when you read historical fiction, that someone will just create something out of the blue to sort of be this MacGuffin, or just a plot point that you kind of want to keep track of. But I was quite happy to notice that our character, John, the American scholar of languages,
he's James. John is me.
James, sorry, James.
John.
John is you. Well,
he's not a self-insert character, I promise.
Despite going to Oxford, you would hope that he's not a self-insert, but at least inspired. Forgive me on that point. No, James, of course, is actually trying to translate something that does exist, and I was quite happy with that. To
you read that stuff?
I did. I did my homework. I read up on the fragments so I could understand what was going on. It's incredible stuff.
Yeah. Well, I just when I started writing the book, I was just reading a lot of that generally. I think I'd probably just reread Beowulf that 4th of July, and then was reading a lot of Norse sagas. So part of the main reason that all that is in the book is that I was just really into it and thought it was cool, and so I threw it in there. But I think it works. I think it, adds some more relevant color to it.
I would certainly say so, and I quite like the section in the book where you have this question of, your life's work, over identity, your passion, or what you dream that you're meant to be called to over home. Because he comes in and he's meeting with the department head over this very question. A man who has not seen his home for many, many years, who's from Scandinavia, and he's
He's
just
from
like,
Iceland.
oh, Iceland. Okay,
He's a real person.
a real person. Okay, well
Yeah.
there you go. It
Just
tells
like the
you.
Wikipedia
I
page
do
is
the I
open.
do the homework for seeing if the thing he's translating is real. I don't bother to check if that character's real at all. That's shoddy work on my end. But well, no, I'm glad. So tell me more about him then. Tell me who he was in real life in comparison to your book.
Yeah, so Gudbrand Vigfússon, he was over in Iceland, mid 1800s, and during that time there is something going on that's generally referred to as the Scandinavian Renaissance or the Norse Renaissance. People in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, sort of riding off the coattails of Wagnerian opera and the whole renewed interest in Germanic mythology, start reading a bunch of Old Norse texts. So they basically import this man over from Iceland and make him a fancy Don at Christ Church in Oxford, and they give him a nice career just hanging around and teaching them how to read Old Norse and translating text for them and that sort of a thing. But then he is diagnosed with cancer. He dies early 1889, and the book starts 1888. He's telling his sort of protege that he secretly has cancer and is asking him to take over from him. So that's sort of based on the real events. I don't know who actually replaced him and if there was any sort of a romantic hubbub about it, but real person.
Well, the more I get to learn. See, always good to ask these sort of questions, right? But no, I quite like the dialogue that James has with him, and just in part because it's not just "oh, I'm dying," but it's a question over purpose. And like we had mentioned at sort of the very beginning, there's that question of, well, can you make your suffering matter? And again, so many every nation, every people has its way in which it expresses, my life's work, or the main motif of literature, just. And I've noticed across the West, whether it be the Germanic, epics, or even just more modern literature from Germany and from England and from the United States, all are sort of trying to answer those questions about suffering, and they answer it in radically different ways. And you can see the character of that culture in there. And so the question over my life's work, will it live after me? And there's that great question and it goes back to, again, the same dialogues that we saw earlier in the text about how the ancients wanted to be remembered. Remember me, not in your kingdom, as we might say in the Christian sense, but remember me in these epics. Remember
Yeah.
me as a great man, as a hero worthy of this tale to be mentioned in someone's epic. Like, make sure I get mentioned in Homer's stories. Go ahead.
There's a moment when he's speaking with Emma, and you were talking about when they do the little walk down to the pub before it starts raining, and James is talking about how he feels that people have a need to point something and say that's what it was for. They literally pointed it. And then when he's talking with Gudbrand, his supervisor, in the next part of the book, Gudbrand literally points at his bookshelf and he's saying, I need to know that this is going to survive. And so I think in that moment, James is supposed to be realizing that even if his sort of career up to that point in literature has been dilettantish and almost he's been sort of a Philistine, as he says earlier on. He just does these things because he likes them, not because he sees them as important. He realizes that not everybody is like that there are people who take this very seriously, and that he himself could be somebody who takes it very seriously, and that he doesn't have to have a simply sort of flouncy approach to academia. It is something that can be dignified and is worthy of being dignified.
Yeah, and I think that there's something about that certainly plays out even to today in our own culture and media is that, and I don't know if you experienced this yourself as an American when you had studied over there, but have you ever, do you know the band Rush by chance?
The
The
like
Canadian
Tom
prog rock
Sawyer
band.
and
Yeah, yeah. There's a great song, and I think it's in the Signals album, called "New World Man," and it's basically just sort of this, look at 1980s America, where he's, young enough to lose the world, but old enough not to, just to more or less criticizing or looking at where America is going as it becomes this emerging dominant 21st century superpower. And I've noticed that that's still definitely there, whether how easy it is to point out an American tourist somewhere, at least for like a white guy, right? Like there's the dead giveaway always being like the white long, Hanes socks or something like that. These little tells that people are, just how overtly friendly we can be, or waving and saying, hi, how you do? Those are still very much there. And I wonder if that kind of national character of perhaps friendliness or naivete exists in comparison to, say, our academic friends across the pond. Is there sort of a difference in character that you experienced in Oxford? Or...
I don't know about naivety. Well, I don't wear long white Hanes socks, but something I do think about very often. Definitely when I lived over in England, people had a sort of stereotypical view of me, but it was as it was a sort of more flattering, vitalistic thing where I was like Kevin Bacon in Footloose, showing up to the town where dancing is illegal, and getting people excited and revved up. So that was nice, and they saw that not just as me as an individual, but sort of as part of the American character. That Americans are high energy and fun loving and break the rules in a good way, sometimes, maybe sometimes in a bad way. But now, being back in the United States for about 5 years now, Americans see me as very English and sort of like stuffy and like almost priggish. So I don't really know what the truth is. I guess the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There is definitely, though, uh, a sense of Americans as being a free people, a spiritually free people. And I think that's not just true with reference to England. I mean, everywhere you go in the world, as much as Americans like to pretend that everybody hates them, people really like America a lot for that very reason. America is very inspiring. Um, it is a land of hope and a land of opportunity, and that is something that they read into our character, whether or not it's actually there. Um, so, yeah, I think there's definitely something to that.
Yeah, I remember when I was younger, if you were to say, "Oh, I'm from Texas," the first thing that I would get asked by anyone who was on the plane from Germany was like, "Oh, do you know Dallas?" And they would always reference in the sense of the TV show. It's just like, "Do you know who shot JR?" And it's like, I understand the reference, even though that's 20 years before me. I appreciate it for what it is, but I think that that's still true, large amount. I haven't been overseas since 2011, although I certainly hope to change that. But there was that sense of optimism that this was the place to be, and it still is. Otherwise, people wouldn't try their best to come here, hell or high water, legally or illegally. But it is something that I think you're definitely right about. Although for me, I guess I always witnessed that was this, depending on which country you lived in or which place that you visited, the French and the Germans might look at Americans with the sense of arrogance, or that we might just be a little too bratty.
Mm.
I think the English definitely had a more like, oh, that's the place to be. That's where the world is going. And I remember this old lecture from Jonathan Bowden. He says, someone could come back from Europe and then he'd land in the Oklahoma City airport and someone would tell him, isn't it great to be back in the world? Because America's the world. And in our frame of reference, I can drive for 5 hours and I'm still in the state of Texas. And that's just the way it is. I leave Germany from where I used to live outside of Heidelberg, and I know that in 4 hours' time, I'm in some other country, in some other climate, in some other mountain range.
But you could still get a great kebab, I'm sure.
Oh, yes, I'm sure I could. I'm sure I could, as I lament knowing the fact that right across the street from me were a Turkish family that was living there. So you certainly could. But let's get back to the book. So let's start there then. So I mean, James, of course, is then shocked to realize that his mother had suddenly passed away, and that he is kind of experiencing the thing that anyone does when they lose their parents, is that he is orphaned, he is alone. And what makes it worse is that he is alone in a country that is not his, and he knows that by the time he gets back, his mother is buried.
Yeah.
And that sort of brings on this, I think, the existential crisis for the story is that his old sort of puritanical mom, and now he's there trying to be an Anglo-Catholic of sorts while studying these ancient texts and languages and understanding Old Norse epics, and what is he to do with himself? And I think that the identity crisis to me is one of the great underpinnings of the story, because anyone who's lived overseas, like yourself or myself, there is that question of, well, what am I? And especially for him, the country is a little over 150 years old at this point. It's not really anything special, but it's about to be, because we're about to have the Spanish-American War and everything else. But he's just like, well, what am I? And I mean, that's a question that any American still has to ask himself today: is what am
Yeah.
I?
And there's a good line. I guess you probably got up to this bit when he goes and gets a pint with one of the other tutors, Jonathan Fox, who is over from India. He's been living in India, and he says it's almost easier being in India because he doesn't have to pretend to fit in, whereas England is just close enough to America that there's an almost uncanny valley where you're not quite home. It is sort of foreign, but not totally foreign. Whereas if you're in the middle of nowhere in India or China or Saudi Arabia, you can just be the guy who's a foreigner, and that's sort of a role that you can fall into.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, and that's definitely true for living in England or really anywhere in Western Europe. Is that if you have roots from that specific country, you feel some sense of kinsmanship to it. I think that the people who still get to lean on this the most, I think, are Irish and Italian Americans the most, because you visit there, you can do all the touristy trap things and try and find where your family's from in that region, but you're also so distant enough now by generations that it's not really there. But England especially, it feels like home. You want it to be home, but it's not
Mhm.
your home. Your ancestors made a decision very long ago with very good reason to decide to break those bonds. You're not part of the
Well, that's
Commonwealth.
part of what he's trying to decide. Were they
Yeah,
good reasons?
that's the ultimate point. Is well, were they? And now it's and I mean, America is so fragmented on identity, and because we've been, I think, really just deracinated, that what is America? Is it could be a question that a million different novels could explore, right? Because it's 2024, and I can go on Amazon right now and I can find 3 or 4 different movies about the history of products that are
Mhm.
American. You have Ray Kroc for the founder about McDonald's. You've got um, there was some movie with Brad Pitt and the not Brad Pitt, with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck about the Air Jordan shoe. And I think Disney has one about the history of the flaming hot Cheeto. Like, that's this corporate Americanization brand. And this is what we tell people: this is America, this is what we are. And that great, and what's so tragic about it, and I'm sure that this is something that you've probably noticed, is that the American canon of literature is lost for most Americans. You can't talk about them, especially if you don't know your scripture. You can't
Mhm.
talk about William Faulkner. You can't talk about, young Goodman Brown, unless you know the religion and the scripture and the culture behind it. Because if you don't, then good luck ever understanding Herman Melville's Moby Dick, right? Do you know who Ahab
There's
is in the
a few
Old
biblical
Testament?
references in there. Yeah.
There's quite a few. And it raises that question. It's just like, well, did America become America for good reasons? There are people on Twitter that talk about being like a Midwestern Marxist, or
Mhm.
wants to bring back the monarchy or make like Texas some sort of czarist republic. And it's just like, okay, we've clearly lost the plot in some areas, but it raises that
Yeah.
existential question for
I will go on the
today.
record and say I do believe in America. Um, and I do think I'm actually pretty optimistic, and I think we have the opportunity to turn it around. But I have seen the sorts of conversations you have as well. I can understand um, why some people would feel that way, but I just think it's a dead end, and I think you're better off rediscovering the original spirit and sort of justifying it rather than throwing it out and doing something completely different.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you wholeheartedly on that. I am very much pro America. I'm not leaving this place. I don't see myself becoming an expat or anything like that. I work with people and organizations that are distinctly pro America and pro history. And one of my favorite things about where I live, and really this is something that applies to almost any American, is that despite how the digital age is gone, if you go to your local county records office or your county's historical society, you're going to find a treasure trove of poets and novelists that weren't national celebrities, but they were local and regional celebrities. And it's something that we used to have as this great tradition, and you get to fall in love with your own place in your own country. There's an antique store where I live that on the first floor, there's this huge little bookstore area. Not only is it used books, but it's books about the region, the
Mm.
specific strange cryptid or ghost story that has made the place kind of famous. And, I've bought every single book that, I've lived all over the place, but now I'm where my family calls home. And I've gotten to fallen in love with these stories and legends and things like that, or learning what parts of the Civil War my family was a part of. And I think that it's much easier to find yourself being rooted in something than it is to just try and invent something on the spot and go from
Yeah.
there. Because one of the most fascinating things is that if you were to go on Twitter right now and go into the search bar and say political compass test, you will find people posting their political compasses where they were in all 4 different quadrants in all different sectors
The
over the
Chad
course.
centrist.
Yeah, the Chad centrist, all different positions. And now they're at some random position, but in the matter of just a few years, they'll go through all different things. And sure, you can say that's a product of being young, but I think it's also a product that there's no real ability to be anchored anymore because we engage in this strange John D. scrying mirror of the internet where all of a
Mm.
sudden we've been transported to a different world and we can talk to people that say, well, really, you should be this, or really, America is about that. And I relate to James very much in this story because he's grappling with that question because this feels like home, but I know that I'm totally divorced from it. And perhaps I can find an answer in something that's even older than the Christianity I practice or older than the country that I hail from. And I think that that's a perfect reflection of the moment that we're in right now for a lot of people in the United States, and especially in the literary scene.
Yeah. So I hope maybe it sets some kids straight. But yeah, I think it's good that people are searching, and obviously you don't want to be searching forever. I think there's a wisdom in just sort of picking your tradition and saying, "This is my tradition. I don't know if it's completely correct. I don't know if it's completely transcendentally true or what that even means, but this is my tradition and I need one, so I'm just going to stick to it." So, live in your hometown and do the religion that your parents did, unless they were atheists, I guess. Then become Catholic. But if they had a religion, just do that one. Commit to it, and exhaust your tradition before you go looking for a new one. Um, Again, James doesn't really come to this conclusion in the book because he doesn't really come to any conclusions in the book. But I think it's a healthy moment that we are in, because people do need to rediscover meaning and tradition and those sorts of things. But you don't want it to go on forever. You don't want it to be an endless loop of changing different branches of orthodoxy, like the different hats. Well, I woke up today and actually I realized Romanian Orthodox is the right one, and well, next day I woke up and actually it's this particular variety of Southern Baptist or something like that. Just pick the one that your family is already doing, and just do that and make it your own. If there's something you think it's missing, then engage with it as a living tradition, and don't just see it as something dead that's been handed to you. Participate in it and make it something active. Maybe push it in certain directions if you don't like certain things about it that exist within it.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's going to be the challenge for a lot of people who weren't raised with anything is either to rediscover their roots or understand that they have some semblance of tradition. They've got to build it. And I think like how James doesn't really come to an answer in the novel, that you're going to have an opportunity to have that dialogue very much for the rest of your life. And I imagine that James certainly will for the rest of his days, if there's ever to have some sort of epilogue for his story. But I think that that's really the important part is that your people are going to go on journeys of self-discovery. And unfortunately, that means that you can find something that looks great, and all of a sudden it's going to be just a fandom with a little profile or a little flag that you can put in your bio, like you said, or like the Chad centrist political compass. You can find all positions and become enlightened, and somehow you can become the fascist, Marxist,
Mm,
Republicanist kind of dream that George Washington was always looking for. And
yeah.
one day it will truly be accomplished. That will be the true completion of German idealism through enlightened centrism. But on the point of ideology, or on the point of the answer of identity, we mentioned that there's a little bit of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche that's referenced throughout there. Were there any other larger influences that you think maybe the audience or the reader should be aware of as they dive into your story?
Um, in terms of philosophy, no. In terms of other influences, I think having some familiarity with Arthurian legends is gonna help you get a lot of the jokes and a lot of the sort of narrative structure. So like the whole trip that he takes up to Yorkshire to the house that he goes to visit is called Corbenic, which is the name of the Grail Castle in Arthurian mythology. So it's all sort of structured as a sort of Parsifal story. So having a familiarity with sort of the meaning of the Grail and Arthurian tales and legends, I think you'll get a lot more mileage out of some of the symbolism. Um, Other than that, no, I think that's about it.
Hmm. Well, yeah, you can't have a story set in England without some reference to Arthurian legend. It's just sort of a requirement there.
Yeah.
So no, I mean, and it's definitely there throughout the novel. There, I had saw it be described as, or I witnessed the passage Twitter feed go off and tell me about all these lovely. What a wonderful smutty book, as if it's parodying the book talkers of our day.
It's really not smutty.
No, it's really not. And I was telling the guys who had sent me the copy, and I was just like, I love the copy, but I said, you're wanting me to interview John. I said, I hope you know that I play the straight man for most of the shows that I do. So it's like I'm looking forward to something interesting. But I mean, I don't care. I've had Dan Baltic on, and I wrote a review for Nutcranker, so anything goes in my book. But the Gonzo advertising aside, no, it's a fantastic book, and I think that it highlights a lot of what's going on in our conversations in America today. I think it's perfect that it's set in a time frame where you're divorced enough from our form of modernity, but it's still in that the same questions are still there. And I thought it was quite a good debut novel. Have you written anything else, or is there any short stories or writing that you've done elsewhere? I mean, I know you said you're not big on creative writing, but is there other works of yours that maybe we can look out for or look into?
Um, I've got some pieces on a Substack I don't use very often, um, but you could look through there. I think I've maybe got two things on there. There's a speech that I gave out in Wyoming maybe 2 months back. That's pretty good. That's on there on the Substack. There's an essay that I wrote maybe a year ago. It's not very good, but it's there. I've got some fragments of new novels that'll be coming down the pike eventually that you can keep an eye out for. But for now, I've got some poetry. I write a lot of poetry. There's a lot of poetry. If you scroll through my Twitter feed, you can sort of find things that I've put up periodically.
Do you have a favorite poet?
Homer, Chaucer.
Well, there you go. Do you have it's always a fun question to ask. Do you have a favorite American poet?
Favorite American poet? Ezra Pound.
Can't go wrong there.
Yeah, I love the Ballad of the Goodly Fear. You
Mm.
talk about vitalism versus Christianity. I feel like he really understood vitalist Christianity in that poem. I don't know if anybody's read it, but it's from the viewpoint of Simon the Zealot after the crucifixion, and he's just screaming at the Pharisees about how they're a bunch of castrated losers, about how Jesus was going to whip them. He's
Well,
a man of men who
that
loves
is
the open sea.
that is not a piece of Pound I've read, and now I feel like I desperately need to. Because
It's my favorite.
I think of the phrase muscular Christianity, because I think of
It's very muscular Christianity. Yeah.
Samuel Chamberlain's My Confession, where he talks about like the choir director didn't like his thoughts on theology, so he punched him outright, and the deacon was like, he's a good guy, let him cool off a little bit. And he's just like, there's your American muscular Christianity right there. So but other than that, what would you say was your favorite part about writing the novel, or if there's a favorite section or piece of dialogue that you quite think you're proud of?
I think I just enjoyed the process of writing it. I hope it comes across in the prose. I read a lot of books, especially by contemporary authors, where it feels very strained. and I can feel like they really had to force themselves to get words onto the page. But I wrote this sort of in a spree, and it was just a romp and a delight, making all these jokes and having a lot of fun with these overly long, overly wrought sentences that could only really be parsed by me on a lot of coffee. Um, so it's just a joy to be swimming around in this absurd prose. Um, in terms of part that I think is the best, there's a section in part 3 where he's wondering if he's going to receive a telegram from somebody and knowing that he won't, and sort of bullying himself for being so romantically absurd. And I think it's very funny. I think that's my favorite part personally. I don't know if you've gotten to that part yet.
I have, and
Yeah.
it's a good bit of dialogue. It's a good bit of mental. I was reading it earlier this week, and I had gotten to a section where it's at I think it's in part 1 or part 2 where he's talking about the debate over who has the claim for the oldest coffee shop. And
Okay.
it's just like this
This is
is
part
this
two.
is the inner dialogue of any man that works with history or academia or is interested about inane trivia. I was like, I had a
Hmm.
literally me moment, and I was just like, all right, so like this is how I know that I'm in for a good time. It's just this little offset about 1650 or 1654, but actually this location also was a bookstore and a toy shop and other things. So if anything, the claim to the world's oldest coffee shop in England is just spurious or legal technicality at best. And I said,
Yeah.
okay, I'm in for a good time.
And he comes up with a completely fake uh, thesis for
Yes.
this research project that he's supposed to do, studying the location of the Battle of Brunanburg. And he gets a research grant to go check out Boroughbridge. And he admits to himself, there's no reason that it would be here. I just wanted money from college to go on a trip to Yorkshire. And then he spends like a few hours just writing complete nonsense, and then is later congratulated by everybody about how genius it was, but completely fabricated. Um, so if you're used to dealing with academia, that may resonate.
Just a tad. Well, I can resonate with it just in terms of working with government, where sometimes a Native American tribe will be like, well, there might be something there, so we're going to send a tribal archaeologist consultant to see if anything's there. Not because we think anything's there, but because we want to, bill you the money for it. And it's just like, I understand how the grift works, sir. I get it. I may not.
It's the exact same grift.
It's the same grift that works in nonprofits and with government. It's the same one in academia. It's a great racket if you know how to make money. It's the same thing about Trump talking about environmental consultants on Rogan. He's like,
Yep.
I would do it myself, as a businessman. I can't fault them for it. And it's like, yeah, I understand. It just costs me more time and money. I like it though too, where he's just like, yeah, I just wanted to visit. And he's just like, well, what a coincidence. I have a home there. Like, why don't you just chill out for a few weeks? And it's perfect. Anyone who's ever tried to come up with a reason to go somewhere, college and government are the two greatest reasons to do it. But with that, John, I wanted to thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you and to chat about your book. I'm thoroughly looking forward to finishing it. I will have a review out myself
Oh,
on
lovely.
Substack, but I'm going to highly recommend for the 2/3 of the text that I have read that you should read this. It is refreshing in terms of the kind of conversations about identity and about language and vitalism in Christianity in a way that I think is tastefully done, but also is reflective, I think, of the inner monologue that a man might have about these things, especially if you are a voracious reader like ourselves about the classics and about our own traditions and our own heritage. So, John, where can people find you? And of course, I will have the link to the book down below in the description. But is there a place where people can
Yeah,
find what your
I'm on
thoughts are?
Twitter. I'm
All
on
right, go
Twitter
for it.
under my real name, uh, foolishly perhaps. So that's at King Spiezio. Um, I do have a Substack also under my real name. I don't post on it very much, but you could go and look at that. And that's about it. I think only
Well,
place.
I will have those down below in the description. And again, the book is available now for purchase. You can go ahead and buy it at the link down below. I highly recommend it. Something of the Springtime. John King Spiezio, thank you so much for coming on, and good luck with your debut novel.
Thank you very much.